They pushed the masked girl to the harp as a joke. The Alpha King never looked away again. The midwinter feast at Harrowfen Hall was the loudest thing I had attended in 4 years of ruling, and I had attended it against my better judgment. My steward Corin had made the case plainly. The northern holds had grown uncertain since the border disputes of the autumn, and the lords who gathered here each year for the Festival of Long Nights needed to see their king in the room, drinking at their tables, not sealed behind the walls of Greymere Keep like a man with something to hide. I had listened. I had come. I had eaten 3 courses of food I did not taste, and spoken with 14 men whose opinions I did not require. And now I sat at the high table with my hands flat on the cloth, and my wolf so quiet inside me that I had almost forgotten he was there. He had been like that for some time. Quiet, folded down, a wolf who no longer offered counsel. I was not concerned about it. I told myself I was not concerned about it. The hall below me was bright with torches and loud with music, a pair of traveling brothers on drum and pipe, working through the same 6 songs in rotating order. The lords' daughters moved in the open floor, showing themselves to one another and to me. My council expected me to notice one of them. I noticed none of them. I watched the fire in the great hearth instead, and counted the number of times the pipe player began the 3rd song before the 2nd was quite finished. It was 11, in case anyone wanted to know. I was not bored. A king who admits to boredom is a king who has lost perspective. I was simply not present in the manner anyone required, and I had made a private arrangement with myself to leave before the 14th song. I was on the 12th when the Lord of Harrowfen himself, a large man named Edric whose goodwill I maintained for the sake of the river roads he controlled, rose from his seat below the salt and clapped his hands for quiet. "My king," he called up to me, with the broad satisfaction of a man who has planned something amusing at someone else's expense. "We have a rare entertainment for the second half of the evening, a traveling girl, taken in at the inn at the base of our hold, a minstrel's daughter, by her own account, though her instrument is an old harp that's seen better decades. My daughters have kindly convinced her to play for the hall." There was laughter already, and I had not yet seen the girl. The laughter came from those who were in on the joke, and from the way they laughed. High and anticipatory, the laughter of people who expected to be entertained by someone else's discomfort. I understood the joke before it arrived. I did not move. I kept my hands flat and my expression neutral, which is what a king does when he is watching something that he does not yet know how to stop. She came through the side door. She was wearing a mask, the kind the traveling performers wore at winter festivals, white painted wood with cutouts for the eyes and a simple carved mouth. It covered her face from brow to chin. Beneath it, dark hair, loose, not dressed for court. A gray travel cloak that she had not been given time to exchange for anything better, and in her arms cradled the way one carries something old and irreplaceable. An iron-strung harp with a crack in its upper pillar sealed with what looked like amber resin. She walked to the center of the floor without hurrying. Edric's daughters, 4 of them arranged near the eastern pillar, were already pressing their hands to their mouths. One of them caught another's eye. The hall murmured, and some of the murmur was unkind. The girl, she was young, early in her 20s, though the mask made it difficult to be certain, set a small stool in the place that had been left for her, and settled the harp against her shoulder. She had done this 10,000 times. Her hands found the strings without looking. "Play something simple," one of Edric's daughters called out, in a voice dripping with performed helpfulness, "so we can follow along." More laughter. The girl did not answer. My wolf stirred. The first movement in, I did not know how many weeks. A small, precise shift, like a man raising his head from sleep. I felt it, and registered it, and said nothing about it, even to myself. She played the opening phrase of something I did not recognize. It was not simple. The first thing I noticed was that the cracked harp did not sound broken. The amber repair had done something to the resonance. A faint double ring on the lower strings, like a second voice underneath the first, and she was playing into it deliberately, using the peculiarity of the instrument rather than hiding it. She played 3 notes that should have been preparatory and made them mean something. The hall did not go quiet all at once. Quietness, in a room that size, with that many people, moves like weather. It starts in one place and spreads. It started at the table nearest her, with a man who had been talking to his neighbor, and simply stopped without finishing his sentence. It moved outward from there. By the time she was 12 bars into the piece, the hall was still. I was leaning forward. I became aware of this midway through and chose not to correct it. She played something that I can only describe as the sound of a thing being found after a long time of searching. Not the arrival, which is a loud thing in songs, but the moment just before. The suspended beat. The breath held. She wrung it out of that old harp the way a practiced hand wrings the last light from a dying fire, and the iron strings rang under her fingers like something alive. My wolf was fully awake now. Not agitated, I want to be precise about that, but present. Oriented. Like a compass that has been wandering for years and has, without announcement, found north. I became aware of a stillness in my own chest. It had no drama to it. It was simply there, the way a key fits a lock without effort, a quiet click of completion, arriving without permission. I did not know what it was. I filed it for later. She played for 9 minutes. I did not watch the room during those 9 minutes. I watched her hands, which were sure and unhurried, and the tilt of her masked face, which was directed at the strings and at nothing else. She was not performing for the hall. She was doing a thing she knew how to do, inside the context of the hall, and those were not the same thing at all. When she finished, the silence held for a moment that I counted. 1, 2, 3. And then the sound that came from the room was not the sycophantic applause that attends a court performance. It was the involuntary kind, the kind that comes out of people before they have decided to make it. Edric's daughters were no longer laughing. The one nearest the pillar had her hand at her throat. Edrin himself began to clap, and it was the clap of a man who has been surprised by his own joke landing wrong. The forced enthusiasm of a host who cannot afford to look embarrassed. I stood. Not because I planned to. My wolf stood, which is to say that my body moved from the chair with a certainty that had nothing to do with deliberation, and when I was on my feet, I was already 2 steps down from the high table before my thinking mind had caught up with my legs. The hall noticed. Of course it noticed. A king rises from the high table and the room watches. It cannot do otherwise. She had not looked up. She was settling the harp carefully upright on the floor in front of her stool, both hands on the pillar, making sure the old instrument stood steady before she took her hands away. She was doing this as though the hall were empty. I crossed the floor. My steward, behind me, exhaled in a way that communicated significant feeling. I noted it and kept walking. I stopped in front of her. She looked up then, eyes behind the mask, dark, with the particular expression of a person who is working out what mistake they have made to cause the Alpha King to cross the room toward them. "What is that piece?" I asked. A long pause. "An old one," she said. Her voice was careful, not frightened, but careful, in the way of a woman who has learned that careful is the wisest default in unfamiliar halls. My father called it the returning. He learned it from his mother. I don't know if it has a formal name. Does it have another movement? 3, she said. But they're long. How long? The second is 11 minutes. The third is... She stopped. You want to hear the second movement? I would like to hear the second movement, I said, if you are willing to play it. Behind me, I could feel the hall holding its breath. Lord Edric, somewhere to my left, was recalibrating his evening at speed. Edric's daughters, I did not check on. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked down at the harp. The second movement is heavier, she said. It was written for grief. I am aware of what grief sounds like, I said. Another pause. Then she said, all right. She picked the harp back up, set it against her shoulder. Her right hand curved over the strings in the preparatory shape, waiting for whatever internal stillness she needed before she began. I sat down, not at the high table, on the edge of the dais nearest where she stood, 2 steps down, on the stone step, like a man who has decided he wants to hear something properly and has no patience for the distance a chair would put between him and the source. My steward was going to have opinions about this. I would hear them in the morning. She began to play. The second movement was, as she had said, heavier. It moved in a different space than the first, lower in the register, with a long repeating phrase in the bass that came around every 16 bars like a tide, steady and patient and relentless. She played it without sentiment. The grief was built into the architecture of the piece. It did not require her to perform it, and she didn't. She let it happen around her the way weather happens around a still point. I sat on the stone step and listened, and felt the quiet click in my chest become something more insistent. My wolf was not agitated. He was certain. That is a different thing entirely, and in 9 years of ruling, since he had last spoken to me with anything approaching certainty, I had forgotten what it felt like. It felt like a judgment. It felt like the end of a long argument that no one had been having out loud. 11 minutes. She played the full 11 minutes, and the hall was silent for every one of them. At the end, she set the harp down again with the same precise care as before. Both hands, the pillars steadied, then released. I was looking at the mask. "Your name," I said. It was not entirely a question. "Lysa," she said. "My lord. I mean your majesty. Lysa of the Ashfen Road. My father was, a traveling performer. He died last spring. I've been—" She stopped. "Reconsidered. I have been playing in halls where I can find work. And Harrofen?" A small pause. "The ladies of the hall were kind enough to invite me to play this evening." She said it without inflection. She was not accusing anyone. She was simply describing the situation as it had presented itself, and she had decided that this was the safest approach, and I found I respected that more than a complaint would have earned her. "The ladies of the hall," I said, "appeared to expect you to embarrass yourself." "Yes," she said, in a tone that communicated she had been aware of this from the beginning. "And you played the returning instead of something simple." A very short silence. "It is the piece I know best. When I am uncertain, I go to what I know." I looked at her for a moment, then I stood. "Lysa of the Ashfen Road," I said. "I intend to return to Greymere Keep the day after tomorrow. I would like you to ride with my company and play in my hall for the midwinter week." I paused. "As a paid position. My steward will arrange fair terms before the end of the evening." The mask was very still. "Your Majesty," she said, after a moment. "That is—" Another pause. "I accept. Thank you." I turned back toward the high table. Behind me, the hall exhaled. She rode with my company, as I had asked, with her harp in a padded case across the packhorse my groom provided, and she asked for nothing during the 2-day journey except a place near the fire in the evenings and, once, for someone to check the strapping on the case when we hit a patch of icy road. She did not require conversation. She wrapped herself in her travel cloak and watched the snow come down and seemed, as far as I could tell, content. My wolf watched her continuously, not with impatience, with interest. The interested attention of something that has settled on a conclusion and is now simply observing the evidence accumulate. I did not speak to the wolf about it. There are conversations you are not ready to have, even with the part of yourself that already knows. My steward Corin rode beside me on the second morning and said, in the measured tone he used when he was saying something he had been practicing, "The traveling musician, Your Majesty." "I know who you mean, Corin. She is not pack-born," he said. I noticed. "The council will." "The council," I said, "will not be consulted about who plays the harp in my hall." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Will she be staying for more than the midwinter week?" I looked at the road ahead, which was white and straight and long. "I don't know yet." He accepted this, because he is a man who understands when the conversation is over. She played in my hall every evening for 6 days. She played after dinner, when the tables had been cleared and the household had settled into the slow, warm quietness of midwinter. Children drowsing near the hearth, the older wolves talking softly at the tables, snow pressing against the high windows. She sat with the harp in the corner of the hall that caught the best firelight, and she played for an hour, sometimes more, and the hall around her became something different than it usually was. Gentler, more patient. My wolf sat and listened the way he listened to nothing else. I sat at the end of the high table and worked through the pile of correspondence that followed me everywhere, and I told myself I was simply working in the same room as the music, and this was not untrue, and it was also not the whole truth. On the 4th evening, she played the 3rd movement of the piece she had called The Returning. I had asked her, quietly, before dinner, if she would. She had said yes. She had said it in the manner of someone agreeing to something they had already decided. The 3rd movement was different from the first two. The first was searching. The second was grief. The third was, I do not have the musical vocabulary to describe it precisely, but the closest I can come is, it was the morning after. Not a triumphant arrival, not a resolution in the grand sense. A quiet, very particular recognition, the acknowledgement that something has been found, and that the finding changes the shape of everything that comes after, without announcing itself. It moved in a major key, but simply, no flourish, no declaration. It was, for lack of a better word, domestic. The sound of something settling into where it belonged. I set down my pen at some point during the third movement and did not pick it up again. The click in my chest, which had been present every evening since Harrowfen, sharpened. It was no longer a curiosity. It was an answer to a question I had been carrying for 9 years without knowing quite how to phrase it. My wolf lifted his head, made a sound that was not a howl and not quite anything else. A low, resonant acknowledgement, the equivalent of a man saying yes, exactly, finally. And I felt it move through my chest like a struck bell, the vibration spreading outward until my hands were still, and my breathing had changed, and the correspondence in front of me was irrelevant. The mate mark on my right wrist, which had been quiet, a faint silver line since my wolf came of age, waiting, grew warm. Not hot. Warm, specifically, the warmth of a thing that has been cold for a long time and has at last been brought near a fire. It spread from the mark to my palm and up the inside of my wrist, and it was not painful, and it was not dramatic. It was simply the most certain thing I had ever felt. She was still playing, the last bars of the third movement, the quietest ones, the ones that did not resolve so much as arrive. I looked at her hands. On her left wrist, below the cuff of her gray sleeve, there was a faint silver light. She saw it at the same moment I did. Her hands slowed, not stopping, not quite, and she looked down at her own wrist with an expression I could not read from across the room. She finished the piece. The hall was quiet for a long moment. Then someone began to clap, one of the older wolves, a man named Rand who had served my father before me, and the room followed, and the sound warmed and spread. She sat very still until it faded. Then she looked across the room at me. I came to the doorway of the small solar where she had been given a room for the week. My steward knew better than to follow me. I knocked at the frame, which was open. She was sitting by the window with her harp across her knees, not playing, running one hand along the strings without pressing, the faintest whisper of sound. "I know what it is," she said, before I could speak. "I've heard of it. My father told me. His mother had it, the mate mark. I thought," she stopped. "I thought perhaps it had skipped me." "It doesn't skip," I said. "No," she said. "I understand that now." I came into the room. There was a chair near the window, angled toward hers, and I sat in it. The fire was low. The snow outside was steady and quiet. "There is no obligation," I said. "I want you to understand that. The mark is not a command." She looked at me. Behind the gray of her eyes there was something that was not uncertainty but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone standing at the edge of a decision they have already, in some fundamental way, made, who is nonetheless aware of the weight of the step. "I know that," she said. "You told me, at Harrowfen, you asked. You didn't arrange." "I am asking now as well," I said, "not arranging." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the courtyard, and somewhere below, one of my wolves called a good night to another, and a door closed. "I have been on the Ashfen Road for 7 months," she said, "since my father died, playing in halls where I can find work, sleeping where the innkeeper has a room, trying to decide what I am now that I am not a minstrel's daughter on tour." She looked down at the harp in her lap. I had not resolved that question. "And now," I said. She looked at her wrist. The mark was still there, not glowing, not performing, simply present, silver on her skin, the way a thing looks when it has always belonged there. "I would like to stay," she said. "Not as your musician. Or, not only as your musician." A pause. "Though I would like to keep playing, if that's allowed." "The harp stays," I said. "I would consider it a significant loss if the harp left." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, or the beginning of one. The first movement of a smile, which is a different thing and in some ways more. "Then I would like to stay," she said again. I reached across the space between our chairs and held out my hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set her fingers in my palm, warm, calloused from years of iron strings, and I felt the mark on my wrist settle into something that was not warmth anymore, but simply rightness. That is the only word for it. Rightness. The particular quality of a thing in the place it was made for. We sat for a while without speaking, in the firelight, in the snow-quieted night, and she played eventually. Softly, one hand free and one still in mine. The first movement of the returning, from the beginning, as though beginning it again. In the morning, I told Corin. He took it with the careful composure of a man who has been expecting something and was hoping he was wrong. He said, "She is not pack-born," again, in a somewhat different tone. "No," I agreed. The council, I said, will be consulted about the border disputes, the river road levies, and the matter of the eastern pasture rights. They will not be consulted about my mate. He looked at me for a long time. He has known me since I was 12 years old and has a fairly accurate picture of which things I can be reasoned with about. "The mark is confirmed?" he said at last. "On both wrists," I said. He exhaled. Then he straightened his jacket, which is what Corin does when he is accepting a situation he did not choose. "I will prepare for a formal announcement," he said. "After the midwinter week," I said. "Let her settle. She has been on the road for 7 months." He nodded and went to do the thing he had been told to do, which is the finest quality in a steward. The council was not pleased. I had anticipated this. There were 3 among them who had put forward considerable effort, in the years since my wolf went quiet, to position their own daughters or the daughters of allied packs as suitable lunas. One of them, Lord Havert, whose opinions were generally strong and frequently wrong, made his case in full, which ran to some length and covered the topics of lineage, pack tradition, and the importance of a settled and politically useful match. I let him finish. Then I put my right hand on the council table, palm down, so the silver mark was visible. "The bond is confirmed," I said, "and it is mine, and it is hers, and it is not a matter before this council. What is before this council is the eastern levies, which we have been avoiding for 3 sessions." There was a silence of the very specific kind that occurs when a door has been firmly closed. Lord Havert looked at the mark on my wrist. Then he looked at my face, which I had arranged to be informative without being unkind. He sat back. We discussed the eastern levies. She did not come to the council chamber, and I did not ask her to. She spent the days of the midwinter week as she chose, playing in the mornings when the hall was empty, walking the courtyard with the wolf pups who found her immediately, and with characteristic wolf pup logic, decided she was interesting. She learned 3 of my old wolves' names and asked them questions about the pack's history with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wants to know, and they answered at length, and by the end of the week 2 of them were bringing her things from the kitchens between meals. She was good at being in a new place. She did not perform belonging. She simply quietly set about understanding where things were, and what mattered, and where the warmth was. My wolf regarded all of this with deep satisfaction. He had been right, and he knew it, and he did not require me to confirm it out loud, though I did, eventually, in the quiet of the 4th night when the keep was sleeping and I was standing in the upper corridor, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard below. I said, "You were right." My wolf made the same sound as before, that low, resonant, finally, and then settled completely, the deepest quiet I had felt from him in 9 years, the quiet of a thing at rest. The announcement was made on the last day of midwinter, in the great hall, with the household assembled. I stood at the front of the hall and I said the things that are said, the bond confirmed, the mark witnessed on both sides, my intention to take her as my Luna when the spring ceremonies could be arranged, and the hall received it the way a hall receives news, that it has been privately circulating for a week already, which is to say with the particular warmth of people who are relieved that an official version now matches the obvious truth. She stood beside me in the dress my household had quietly arranged, simple, dark blue, good wool, nothing ostentatious, exactly what she would have chosen herself if she had been the one choosing. She had, to my private delight, kept the harp case leaning against the wall at the side of the hall. In case, she had said, with a straight face, someone wanted to hear a piece after the announcement. 3 of the older wolves did. She played in the hall that evening, as she had played every evening, in the firelit corner, the harp against her shoulder, my household settling around her into the particular quiet she made wherever she went. The pups had arranged themselves near her feet. Old Rand was at his usual place at the near table, with the expression of a man who feels his evening has been properly organized. I sat at the end of the high table, and I did not pretend to do correspondence. I watched her play. The mark on my wrist was warm and constant and sure, and my wolf lay easy in my chest, and outside the snow was coming down over Greymere, in the long untroubled way of a winter that has nothing urgent to accomplish, and the hall was full of light. At Harrowfen, they had pushed a masked girl to the harp as a joke. I have thought about that evening many times since. I have thought about what would have happened if I had left before the 14th song, as I had planned. If I had been looking at the fire at the moment she walked through the side door. If my wolf had stayed folded and quiet, and I had never stood from my chair. I do not think it would have mattered. I think the bond would have found its way regardless, on some other road, in some other hall, eventually. That is what a bond is, the thing that does not fail to arrive. But I am glad I was there. I am glad I was leaning forward before I had decided to lean forward, and that my feet took me across the floor before my thinking mind had time to intercede. She finished the piece she was playing and looked up, and her eyes found mine across the room, in the easy way they had learned to do, and she smiled. The full version this time, not the first movement of it. I had not, as it turned out, been bored at all. I had simply been waiting. And now the waiting was done.